Everybody, this is Dean Cohen. I want to welcome you all back for the second session in our panel discussions on U.S. democracy after the insurrection. This is, the morning panel that we had was really focused on the United States. This panel will be giving a global perspective. Once again, we're tapping our wonderfully talented faculty. It's just speaks volumes about the school that we can put together several really high quality panels on this subject without having to even think about looking outside. Once again, the panel will be chaired by my friend and colleague, Vice Dean for Education and Academic Affairs, Filipe Campante. Dean Campante is a Bloomberg Distinguished Associate Professor of Economics at both the Krieger School of Arts and Sciences and at SAIS. He's a remarkably wide-ranging economist who's very interested in not just in questions of economics, but also political decision-making, the way in which culture shapes that, and a lot more. And with no further ado, Filipe, I'm going to hand the floor over to you. Thanks for being here.
Thank you, Dean Cohen. Another fantastically brief and to-the-point introduction. And it's a great pleasure to have you again, if you joined us this morning, which was a fantastic panel, which, as Dean Cohen mentioned, was sort of focusing a little bit more on sort of the internal dimension of the current events in the U.S. But one thing that is great about SAIS is that we can have in our faculty this amazing an amazingly deep perspective from kind of other regions and other parts of the world, and the way they can inform what we're seeing here in the US. And this is what this panel is about, kind of trying to put this into a global perspective as we can do in unparalleled fashion here at SAIS. And I have the pleasure to be joined by three of my brilliant colleagues in alphabetical order. Eugene Finkel, who is an associate professor here at SAIS and who works on the intersection of political science and history, and focusing a lot on sort of how individuals and institutions respond to extreme situations, right? To violence, to state collapse, to rapid change, ranging from contexts, in Eastern Europe, the former Soviet Union, the Holocaust. So a very broad set of expertise. And his forthcoming book on reform and rebellion in weak states, which is forthcoming with Cambridge University Press, seems actually strangely relevant to the current U.S. context in ways that perhaps might not have been as clear a while ago. Our second panelist is Lissel Hintz, who is an assistant professor here at SAIS and who works on issues that pertain to how identity sort of affects politics, and in particular, kind of how it intersects with foreign policy. And her research focus is on Turkey. And, as an example, her 2018 book on identity politics and, national identity and foreign policy talks about one of what I think is by now kind of one of the paradigmatic cases of sort of, let's call it democratic backsliding in the sort of populist age, which is the AKP in Turkey. So I think, again, her expertise is absolutely timely and very useful for us to think about our current context here in this country as well. And last but certainly not least, we have Pavi Suryanarayan, who is also an assistant professor here at SAIS, and who works on issues also related to identity, but particularly how kind of group-based inequality shapes political behavior, shapes institutions in sort of multi-ethnic countries like India, which is the focus of a lot of our study, but also the United States, right? And ranging from issues of ethnic politics, how that guides voting behavior, how state capacity can evolve or devolve in response to all these political incentives. And she's been publishing her work in all the very top outlets in political science as well. So really a great team of experts. And if they can start off on their video feed so that we can start our panel. So here they are. And I actually would like to start off with each of them going through their initial considerations, but I like to do that kind of with a motivating question to sort of start us off in our discussion here. And the question that I thought is, it's very common for Americans, I would say in particular, to think about our political system here as very unique, as very exceptional in some sense, right? Now, given your perspective as specialists in different parts of the world, ranging from Eastern Europe, the Middle East, South Asia, how surprised have you been with the last four or 5 years in the U.S., and particularly the last couple of months, let's say, after the election? So I'm going to start again in alphabetical order. So I'm going to ask Eugene to take his 8 to 10 minutes to begin with, and then Lissel and Pavi can step in as well. So Eugene, what are your thoughts here?
Thanks, Filipe. Thanks for the introduction, and thanks for having me. It's a pleasure being here, and the previous panel certainly set a very high bar. Now, was I surprised? And even though I'm going to talk about that, from the comparative perspective, I obviously can't escape talking about the US as well. So I wasn't surprised, and I was surprised. I wasn't surprised about what happened. I was a bit surprised about how exactly it happened. That's not exactly what I imagined, in my wildest dreams of a mass of American citizens, including people with belts and horns hats, storming the Capitol and roaming around carnival style. So when we talk about that, we need to separate the last 4 to 5 years and the broader phenomenon and the post-election phenomenon. And you started, with the premise Americans tend to think of their own political system as unique. They do. But I certainly do want to take issue with that. The US is indeed in many respects different, but it's hardly unique. And everyone who studies countries other than the US, well, on that panel, they will probably tell you that the country they study, people there think that their system is unique, and we make our living out of showing that they are not. And the US is no different here. Now, just to give you an example, so several professors here at SAIS edited the comparative politics publication of the American Political Science Association. I am the lead editor. Lissel and Pavi are part of the team. And 2 years ago, we did exactly that. We did an entire issue, 15 or so articles devoted to just one topic, the US in comparative perspective. And it turned out that no matter what you look at, from political polarization to mortgages to housing market to violence, you name it, US might be different, but it's a difference of a degree rather than a difference of a kind from many other cases. And the same processes that drive politics and society and economics in the US, they're also present elsewhere. So if you look at that comparatively, Trump is certainly a part, and I'm talking about last 4 to 5 years, rather than the immediate post-election. It's certainly part of a much broader phenomenon that I observe in my work on Europe. Brexit, rise of right-wing nationalist parties in Western Europe, but also in Eastern Europe, the rise of illiberal democracy, especially in Eastern Europe, Poland, and Hungary. Trump would fit perfectly well with that. So certainly nothing quite surprising there as well. It's a part of a broader phenomenon. The more interesting stuff is the post-election and the violence itself. And that also did not surprise me in several respects, because obviously, after the storming of the Capitol, people in this country were shocked and flabbergasted and tried to understand what was going on. But if you look at psychology and behavioral economics, they have all the answers. People in that crowd and the Republican elite, so large chunks of the Republican Party, they're in what we call the realm of losses. Not just electorally, they certainly lost an election, but more broadly, socially, economically, in terms of status, and what we know from psychological studies done on different populations, from Kurdish insurgents in Turkey to Palestinians to Israelis, you name it, is the same phenomenon that people in the realm of losses tend to take riskier and riskier bets just to reverse those losses. And there is no doubt in my mind that people who are in that crowd operated psychologically in the realm of losses. So just to give an example for people who don't know, this literature think about a gambler in a casino who is losing and then starts throwing more and more money just to reverse those losses. It's not an American phenomenon. It's a universal phenomenon, and that did not surprise me as well. The timing also did and did not surprise me. It did not surprise me that we saw this violence after the election. We had a wave of post-electoral protest and post-electoral violence throughout Europe and Eurasia, the Color Revolution, the Euromaidan in Ukraine, and they all happened immediately after the elections for different reasons, but the timing again did not surprise me. Elections are a focal point. Elections are a focal point, so they allow people to coalesce, they allow people to express grievances, they allow people to organize. But those protests that we know of elsewhere usually are quite peaceful. So what's the difference? And here again, we do have comparisons from elsewhere, especially Ukraine, where one of those protests not tied to the election, granted, did turn violent, and there are pretty clear explanation for why it did turn violent. And the reasons was the presence of radical, extreme right nationalist groups who drove the violence, so we certainly do see those parallels. So how does it translate to the US context? I mean, we tend to think about American politics in terms of rules, processes, committee hearings, Congress appropriation, but we tend to forget that culturally is a pretty violent society with a pretty violent history, and the American history and the American violence is by and large more extensive than elsewhere. Everyone has a civil war on their mind, but every major event in American history was a civil war, civil violence of some sort: independence war, Western expansion, race rights, you name it. In that, the US is quite different from the rest of the world, and the American society, unfortunately, is more violent, especially when it comes to presence and acceptance of groups who use violence as a pretty legitimate solution, either real or potential, to solving political differences. Here I'm talking about militias and right-wing nationalist groups. That's not something that most of the other world is familiar with. And that again also shows that nobody should have been surprised about the violence that happened. What did surprise me, as I said earlier, is the specific form it took. Again, in my wildest dreams, I could not have imagined that it will turn out the way it did with a mass storming of a capital. Knowing about how those militias and those armed groups operate, I expected something different. I expected either a mass shooting or an assassination. That luckily did not happen. And that, I think, is thinking about those events comparatively. I think that's the only silver lining that we can find here. Things could have been much, much worse. And we got lucky. There is a wonderful Hebrew saying, Yoter mazal misechel, that translates more or less like more luck than brains. And I think that's what the US had over the last month. The brains failed miserably, and we just got lucky, because if we look at violence, post-election violence elsewhere, stormings of the parliaments, again, the storming of the Capitol was not the only attack, not even in the American history, but in other cases as well. It could have been much, much bloodier, and once again, we got lucky. So I will stop here for now.
Thanks, Eugene. That was a fantastic, tour de force through, history and many different countries. So, Lisselle, let me pose a question again to you. How surprised have you been, over the last 4 or 5 years, and particularly over the last couple of months at developments in U.S. politics, given your perspective as a scholar and citizen?
Yeah, thanks so much, Filipe. Thanks to everyone for joining us. It's a pleasure to be here. I think as someone who studies Turkey, I really wasn't that surprised at all. And I think perhaps I expected it to turn out even worse. Eugene did a great job in evoking some behavioral economics and political science theories of prospect theory. I'm going to speak from the bureaucratic politics model, which is where you sit is where you stand, and sort of your expertise and your interests shape how you sort of assess particular outcomes. And I think having studied Turkey and the de-democratization processes that have happened there so quickly, Filipe, you're exactly, on point, saying that Turkey is one of the epitome cases that we're talking about in terms of democratic erosion. That you really see a lot of these processes happening in the US. And in fact, I thought they could have gone even further. I thought that there could be some kind of challenge at the Supreme Court. So in fact, I was quite, of course, horrified by the violence that happened at the Capitol. I thought from an institutional perspective, there might have been even sort of weaker challenges to him than we saw. I think the point about exceptionalism is a really important one for us to look at. This term American exceptionalism, this belief that, this can't happen here. We're the premier democracy in the world, the shining city on the hill, all of these, national myths that we tell ourselves. Whitewashes our history, as exactly, Eugene was pointing out. Now, that's not unique to the United States. Every national curriculum includes some stories and excludes others, tells some points of view and excludes other points of view, admits some atrocities and covers up others. So that's not unique to the United States. And if you, want a Turkey example, you could look at the Armenian genocide question and how, hotly debated that is in Turkey. And when you step outside of Turkey, people say, why is this even a debate? A lot of people would raise that particular example. Even from the perspective of political science, the discipline in which Pavi and Eugene and I were trained, you have this subdisciplinary divide between Americanists and comparative politics scholars. Somehow the study of judicial politics in the United States is different and separate than it is for Turkey or, Poland or India. And so you don't have those, cross subdisciplinary debates as much as you should. Now, of course, they exist, but there are some barriers to that. So I think these kinds of forums where we're looking at, questions of US conditions from a comparative perspective is super important. From the Turkey perspective, as I said, it's one of these kind of premier cases of de-democratization. There's a number of different sort of what I would think of as sites or mechanisms of de-democratization that we can look at as also having happened in the United States. So one of the ones that we may think of most prominently both in Turkey and the US, and I do think that there are lessons for the US here, is the treatment of the media. And so when you have an AKP government that is demonizing any kind of opposition media, Turkey was the leading jailer of journalists for several years. It's always right at the top. When you have media stations that are shut down, that are co-opted by the government, and when you also have sort of more informal political economy ways of silencing the media, having gigantic corporations buy out newspapers, and then, maybe they don't have incentives to write critical columns about the government and so forth. At this point, you have in Turkey, 90 to 95% of the media is pro-AKP. And that's not just through formal censorship. That's through these gigantic holding companies that have political interests and financial interests, but also, of course, own the media. And then, of course, there's the vilification of opposition journalists. And I think one of the first things we think of when we think of Trump is the term fake news, and the idea that the press is the enemy of the state, and that, anyone who is reporting anything that is in any way, and my goodness, did he take this to a personal degree, right? Anyone's writing anything critical has to be lying. And so I think that was really an extraordinarily effective strategy that he used to demonize the media. If we think of other sorts of sites of de-democratization, stacking the judiciary, promoting particular or sort of rallying around particular candidates for judicial positions, making sure that they are going to be favorable to you. We can think of the Supreme Court, but we can also think of that on multiple different levels of the judiciary. One of the, I think, mechanisms that has been so important to understand, and this is why even for me, the violence at the Capitol wasn't necessarily surprising. Maybe, as Eugene said, sort of the form it took, is this process of what I call rhetorical vilification, and how you turn an opposition into an enemy that basically deserves and necessitates violence. And there's multiple ways that politicians can do that. Just to give one super quick example from Turkey, you had the Gezi Park protests in 2013, which started out as a super sort of small environmental protest, but became a nationwide protest overnight. And the government's response to that as a counter mobilization strategy was basically to sort of, name them as terrorists, name them as hooligans, name them as violent insurrectionists, call them drunkards and so forth. So you're using these naming strategies, blaming, that is sort of creating fictitious events that somehow these people were supposedly involved in. There's this famous case of how supposedly Gezi protesters went into a mosque and drank alcohol and did all the kinds of things that you can imagine would be offensive to Muslim culture. Well, it turns out the imam of that mosque said they even took off their shoes when they came in, fleeing tear gas. So it was a complete fabrication. So you can have these blaming strategies. And then framing. You place the protesters in sort of a wider, larger, nefarious context. And for the Gezi protests, this is the Jewish lobby, this is the American Soros lobby, right? And in doing so, you not only delegitimize the opposition, but you make it appear that they deserve and need a violent response. So in the case of Trump, what we saw during the Black Lives Matter protests was a lot of naming, the use of the word thug, for example, which carries a racial connotation, terrorists. You had blaming. There was an extraordinary amplification of those, who were engaging in looting. It looked from pro-government or pro-Trump media that everybody was engaging in looting and violence and so forth. So you have the naming, you have the blaming, and then framing. These larger, radical leftist, nefarious groups that are funding this. These aren't indigenous, real American protesters, patriotic American protesters. No, these are, sort of peons that have been manipulated from the outside. So you can kind of look at these different strategies and understand how they happen in the United States and how you can sort of create this polarization and this belief that others are not just different, but dangerous. And that, I think, is one of the most important lessons that I take from the Turkish context in the US one, and one of the ways that we can understand part of the violence that happened at the Capitol.
That was great. I think a lot of parallels that just get us thinking about the similarities, the differences. I'm sure we're gonna have a great discussion afterwards. So thanks a lot, Lisa. That was great. Pavi, here again to you. How surprised were you with the last 4 or 5 years and the last couple of months? Giving your perspective as a scholar of Indian politics in particular. Again, one of the world's great democracies that. I'll let you talk more about that. But how surprised were you? How surprised are you?
Well, first of all, Filipe, thank you so much for having me in this really, really fantastic and interesting panel. As you mentioned in your intro, my mainstay in my research is Indian politics, but more recently, I've actually started to study the American states. And the reason for this is the two countries share more than a passing familiarity. I mean, long-standing democracies, as you call them, but countries where people really take that small d democracy very seriously. That vote means a lot to them. The degree of personal engagement in politics is very high. Both are federally organized countries. Both have what we call a winner-take-all electoral system. Whoever gets the most votes wins. And so each of these produces a certain kind of electoral and voting dynamic, which, you can't help but compare these two countries. But for me, most significantly, I think both of these countries have politics that are characterized by their history of slavery on the one hand in the US and caste in India. So that legacy of racial and caste politics makes them ripe for a certain kind of politics that we have seen play out, which is a politics of backlash, right? And so from that perspective, it was totally unsurprising to me as somebody who studies Indian politics to watch the rise of Donald Trump, because it hearkened to me the rise of Modi. somebody who channels that notion of, make America great again speaks a lot to make Hindu India great again, right? It speaks to the grievances of a white racial majority and a Hindu upper caste group in India. And it speaks to the Christian sort of feeling of victimhood in the United States and the Hindu sense of victimhood in India. So this combination of backlash politics meets populist right-wing speak, for me, it was like watching the two countries imitate each other over the past few years. But in doing so, I will tell you, I was shocked by two things. And I think both of those stem from the kinds of things I study. The first is party politics, right? I have been stunned by how little the Republican Party could do to rein in extremism within its ranks, right? I think of India as having the kind of factionalized, weakly organized parties that are prone to leader-centric dynamic. That I did not expect from a party system like the US, where you imagine a Republican or a Democratic Party would do a much better job of using its role as gatekeepers, to keeping out extremist language, to picking leadership that speaks to more moderate and median, sort of voters. And so that part of his has constantly shocked me over the past few years. And another variation of that is how little the other, branches of the government, the legislature, most notably right now, which was the victim of the attack on the Capitol, has been able to rein in Trump. And so for me, this attack on the Capitol was like a living metaphor of what has happened over the past few years. His attack on institutions, most notably the legislature itself, seemed to come alive that day when he didn't take seriously this branch of government that was doing its duty that day. And so that part of me part of what has happened surprised me, because I would have thought institutions, particularly parties and the other branches of government, would be a lot more powerful in holding him accountable than they have been. The second thing that surprises me is, I study the link between identity and institutional strength. So one of the things I look at is how identity politics can make coalitions possible that weaken institutions. And I study that in India historically, and I study that in the US after the Reconstruction. But so to me, was shocking was to see a sort of post-Reconstruction kind of weakening of institutions come alive at the federal level in the United States. Within a dizzying 4 years, you've seen an attack on the USCIS, you've seen an attack on the State Department, you've seen a weakening of the Postal Service, you've seen a weakening of the IRS. The dizzying speed at which Trump has managed to weaken these long-standing bureaucratic institutions has come as a shock. So one of the things I want to do today is to suggest that Americanists can, gain a lot of analytical leverage by not just classifying what we observe as a form of backlash politics, but to try and understand where those impulses come from and how much categories like race have in common with categories like caste, and trying to understand where support for the kinds of leaders come from and the actions they take once they're in office, which often involve, taking an axe to long-standing institutions as a means to defer popular politics and as a means to defer, the consequences of democracy when other kinds of groups come to power. So this is a form of, taking the state away from people who could do things with the state as a voice to backlash politics. So with that, I'll stop and open it up for questions.
Yeah, this is all great. If I may put myself into the discussion a little bit, because I'm originally from Brazil, and kind of I share some of the sense of sort of that perspective of sort of seeing my country of origin kind of go through like a very similar process as the US, or that feeling of seeing things being replayed kind of in on my two countries at this level. It's been almost sort of a disorienting experience, I would say. So that's great. So I will encourage folks to send questions our way through the Q&A function in Zoom. So now we're going to open up for questions. So let me take the lead role here, and again, sort of building a little bit on my own perspective, given my background and all of that, and I would put it out there, I think, for the three of you, but since I think you've thought about this, which is the role of violence, which we've, you guys have alluded to, but also think a little bit about the role of, the military and sort of, security forces in general, kind of on the one hand, and then the sort of the armed citizens on the other hand. But these are things that I feel like you've seen emerge in the discourse in the U.S. to the point that, a bit after the election, we saw, let's say, all the living secretaries of defense put out a statement to defend the idea that the military should not get involved, right? And that sounds so familiar to me that, the question, like, what will the military do, right? As being kind of a big question in politics, what will the security forces do? So if I may pose that question, like, given your expertise sort of from different places, how do you see this in the US context now, but also, historically, as I think Eugene in particular alluded to, but also going forward? Are we seeing what has changed, what is different, what is comparable to other contexts in the role of violence, but in particular kind of the security forces, the military and such?
Okay, so I might go first if you prefer. So I don't think the big question is what the military will do. I don't think that there was any real concern about the generals. I think the bigger question is what the members of the military will do, and that's I think the key question, because what we know, the danger to democracy from the military comes in two forms: either the coups or members of the military using the violence that they learn in the military to achieve other goals. And we also know that most coups are committed by the top brass, the general officers. So as long as the general officers are committed to democracy, and it was pretty clear from the US context that they are, I don't think that the stability of the regime itself was at stake. What is much more dangerous is, again, the members of the military using the violence that they learned to achieve their political goals outside the realm of accepted politics. And that's what we're increasingly seeing in the US. I mean, if you look at the numbers of people who are charged for their participation in the Capitol riots, and of course, being charged does not, it's obviously a bias and not full sample, but the numbers of people with military or police background in this crowd were substantially higher than in the rest of the population. And that's, I think, is quite dangerous for a society that relegates military service and the professional use of weapons to only a segment of its population. And when that segment or members of that segment become radicalized, and it's not a secret that quite a few members of the US military forces do share those racial and white nationalist views and ideas, and we do see, I think yesterday or the day before, some news emerged about a survey that the DOD from 2007 that the DOD tried to suppress about large members, non-white members of the US military experiencing racism within the ranks. I think that's the key danger, because when those people are willing to use violence to achieve their political goals, that's the bigger danger for the US democracy, rather than the generals coming in Brazil or Latin American style and taking over the state. So the destabilization from the military would come from below rather than from above, and that does scare me.
Yeah, if I could sort of jump in on that, I think that's a great take. From my perspective as someone who studies Turkey, maybe one of the sort of preeminent examples of Praetorianism, where you had for many years a government that was sort of serving at the pleasure and with the permission of the military, and having the main political party be established by the military in the first place, the party that still exists, the Republican People's Party, that carries the legacy of Mustafa Kemal Atatürk. A soldier, of course, who fought Turkey's War of Liberation, but also was the country's first president and legacy founder and so forth. But also a military that was highly involved in shaping society and shaping what its individuals would look like, what kind of education they would have, what kind of identity they would have. In Turkey, you had military coups in 1960, 71, 1980, 1997, and of course, 2016 as well. That's not what we have in the United States. It's certainly not the case of a military coup. Although if you're a political scientist and on January 6th, you were to sort of, follow anything having a coup hashtag on Twitter, you would see that one of the biggest debates going on is what is happening today a coup? I don't want to get into that and take a position on that. But I, was sort of finding myself in a very strange position of having my friends from Turkey, text me to say, are you okay being in DC? Because we think there's a coup going on there. And that was something I hadn't expected. Although I do think it's really important to think about the role of the military, because we're now asking questions that we wouldn't have asked a year or two ago. I think this is a strange position for a lot of Americans to find themselves in. Although all commissioned officers take an oath to support and defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. We don't often think about the domestic enemies part, and there are pages and pages dedicated to trying to figure out what exactly constitutes a domestic enemy, although I think no one can deny that what we saw on January 6th was a case of insurrection by domestic enemies. And so, we're asking these kinds of questions in terms of the role of the military. And I think there are sort of two main events that lead to sort of raising these questions. And one was, of course, as I mentioned earlier, during the Black Lives Matter protests. And what you had was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, General Mark Milley, escorting President Trump in uniform across Lafayette Park after having dispersed protesters using violent methods to do so that he could hold up a book in front of St. John's Church. Now, shortly after that, General Milley released a statement saying, literally, I shouldn't have been there. This gives the impression that the military is involved in domestic politics. I don't want that. So he retracts it and he says he shouldn't have done it. But that moment, and I remember watching it live, was unexpected. That was not something that we're accustomed to seeing, that the most powerful or highest ranking military official in the United States escorting a president across that park for a photo op. So that was, I think, something that really started raising the question of, is the military going to be loyal to him? We know that he praises the military. He wants military parades on the sort of, stage or sort of the level of North Korea and Russia and so forth. And then the second came actually, I think about 2 months later, when a couple of retired soldiers, very prominent retired soldiers, wrote an open letter to General Milley saying that if Trump refuses to leave on January 20th, and if he loses, that it's up to the military to remove him. And now all kinds of civil military relations, from Corey Shackey to James Joyner, wrote lots of reasons of why that's not the case, and it needs to be a political process. But we did see these kinds of questions come up about the role of the military. I 100% agree. I think it's important to have these questions, but I think the greater worry is the militias. And there we can actually see a lot of examples from Turkey as well, where you have sort of, militias that are organized around pledging their oath to a particular individual, that they will die to defend that individual, that they believe that he is their savior and so forth. And so if you can think of the Oath Keepers and the Proud Boys and so forth in the United States, and who are encouraged to use violence as well. I think that's the greater lesson that we can draw from Turkey in terms of violence and the future going forward.
I think it's amazing how we can we keep kind of navigating this line between oh, this is really bad, but it's still different, and what does that portend for the future? It's a lot of questions. Pavi, do you want to say something about that?
I want to say a couple of things. The first is, both the US and India have been sort of distinctive in how much civil-military relationships have explicitly been apolitical. And India really prides itself on this, that the military is always subservient to the political will of elected officials, and they stay out of politics. And what is interesting is that both Modi and Trump have tried to, poke that and breach that over the past few years. And so far, both sides in both countries, these organizations have tried to keep themselves away from politics. And I really want to second what Eugene said earlier, which is the real troubling thing is the rank and file military, who have come back from, experiences elsewhere and are finding themselves getting wrapped up in this politics. And there's some very good research that has come out of, the demobilized forces after World War II in India and the instrumental role they played in partition violence. And they turned out to be a major, both on the one hand, a collective organizing force that could keep things calm, but on the other hand, also as a force that could really unleash violence. So I think we need to take seriously, the extent to which the lower ranks of the military find themselves caught up in political violence. And I also want to shift the terrain of security to also policing. I think the thing about Indian research that tells us is how political policing is. And, if states are very keen to use police instrumentally, they can do so. They can withhold police interventions to allow violence like this to occur if it means electoral gains for a party, right? And so that's another thing we have seen in India is how political policing can be, and that's lessons that the US should take seriously about the extent to which their police departments have been politically captured and are acting in their own self-interested ways in politics. So I think this is where I'm hoping research will shed more light into the sort of collective mobilizing forces provided by these rank and file members in various.
Yeah, I think it's a great. Sorry, I think it's a great point, right? When we think about like security forces, that's not just about the military, and particularly I think in the context of the US, where the police is very kind of militarized at some level, right? And has weapons. Eugene, you want to add something to this point?
Yes, just one point. I think just to jump off what Pavi just said, I think what we're seeing is a long-term and probably unintended but inevitable consequence of the American government's decision to forgo draft and move from a draft all national to a professional military force, because both the role of the military and the expectations from the military and the treatment of the military, to me, as someone, again, I'm Israeli, I come from a state where the majority of the population do serve, and it's taken for granted, and that is the best way to prevent the military from playing active role in politics as a corporate body. Everybody serves, everybody knows how to handle a weapon, so it's not really a threat that some people are more trained than others, and some people pose more danger to the society and to the government than others. And here what we do see is this consequence of decision to relegate military service and to relegate the use of weapons to a strictly defined group of citizens who also share some commonalities in their political attitudes, in their origin, in their training, and in their outlook. Now, does it mean that the US should reconsider its decision, to have a professional military? I'm not sure, and it's certainly not my job, not my job to advise. But that's an inevitable consequence of that decision, from my point of view.
Oh, that's very interesting. I think there's like lots of interesting research questions even popping up here. Like that's one of them. I like that connection between sort of the structure of military service and sort of these political downstream implications. But I wanted to change tack a little bit, prompted by a question from Brent Weingart in our Q&A, and is asking, I think, something that has occurred to a lot of us. Is, as we were watching, I guess in horror, the events of January 6th, at some level, and I think Eugene alluded to that, like clearly a lot of those people were not what you would expect from kind of an armed insurrection, right? There was this sort of carnival feature, and as Brent puts, is like, those people seem to have no idea, at least many of them, like what to do, right? Once they kind of got into the building and they were like taking selfies, not all of them, and we can get into that. But what could have happened at that point that could perhaps have destabilized, the country's political system more than it did, right? Which is, ultimately just delayed the electoral college proceedings that were taking place and took place a few hours later. What could have happened at that moment? Again, like coming from that comparative perspective that might have taken things in a different direction.
One semi-automatic rifle effectively used would have changed the dynamics completely. And for everyone who want to know what an attack over parliament could do, just Google Armenia 1999, when a group of protesters stormed the parliament building, killed 8 people, including the prime minister and some other officials. And that again, why the US got lucky that seemingly no one in that crowd had weapons that could have led to mass violence, because if there was a mass shooting in the Capitol building, I assume that we would be having a very different debate right now.
I think one of the really important points that Eugene sort of alludes to is the role of contingency in protest and revolution, and how one small event can change things. I'm thinking of the Black security guard who led a group of rioters, of insurrectionists, away from the Senate floor. Although maybe they didn't have the weapons that Eugene is talking about, that could have turned out very, very differently. I think also one of the things and I think political science is getting a lot better at doing this, is recognizing the variance in the sort of skill sets and the motivations of protesters, rioters, insurrectionists. I think that there were a lot of people there who would have just considered themselves protesters, or those who sort of went along for the ride. Maybe they didn't have the intention to use violence. Most of them certainly stuck around even when they saw violence happening. We know that people can get caught up in violence. We know that individuals' intentions and motivations can change when they're surrounded by those who are pushing forward against the gates, and maybe you never thought you would have pushed past a police officer, but all of a sudden in the moment you find yourself doing that. The role of emotions is getting studied a lot more, and the dynamics of emotions is getting studied a lot more in political science. So I think those are some of the things that we can look at in terms of what could have happened, how could it have gone differently, recognizing that very small things can have very, very large effects on those kinds of outcomes.
Avi, you want to add something?
Yeah, I think
that?
I have a slightly different perspective. I don't think anything much would have been that different as an outcome. And I think it's maybe my Indianist perspective, having lived through in my own lifetime the assassination of 2 Indian prime ministers, and the fact that America itself has experienced multiple presidential assassinations. I think we would have been a little bit more horrified, a little bit more shocked, but I don't think we would be in that different a place today than we were in any of these different scenarios. A few people more dead, a nation more horrified, but I think we would have regrouped in much the same way as we are. And maybe a handful more Republicans would support impeachment. That I'm not even there. I'm not hopeful. Maybe a handful, But I just think that, you made this point, Filipe, and Eugene made it too earlier. Like, America has lived through a lot of violence. It's a very violent country, and it's seen that violence at many levels of government and through several unstable periods in its history. So I don't know if we would have really gone to a different decision node just because a few more people died that day. I think we would be right where we are right now, maybe more depressed and a little bit more horrified.
Yeah, again, like that perspective of kind of how horrific it was, how maybe like some, certain strengths are there. Even then, like, should we presume that these trends will continue into the future? I mean, these are all like absolutely, stirring questions. So one thing that I wanted to, again, changing tacks a little bit and going to some perhaps structural features here, and probably in particular, I think you've done a lot of work on sort of the ethnic dimension of politics, and we've talked a little bit about that. And I often think that at least in sort of general discourse, we tend to think about like tribalism and ethnic politics as something that happens like over there, right? Oh, in Afghanistan, it's like tribal politics. That's terrible. Or in Iraq, or like what have you. What similarities or differences do you and Eugene, Lissel, you as well, how similar or how different do you think like U.S. politics is and historically has been on this ethnic dimension relative to other contexts?
Maybe I'll go first, because once I start on this topic, you can't stop me. But one of the things that really stands out for me is how much the US is what I think of as a ranked ethnic system. And, in that way, it shares a lot of similarities to countries like India, to South Africa, and to some extent to Brazil too, Filipe. And here, I mean, an ethnic system in which, individuals have a social rank, which they're often born with, right? So if you think of the caste system in India or the racial system of the United States, that birth-based rank, makes you sort of susceptible to ethnic appeals of a specific type. And this is what I think really unites the US and India, is how much that race-based appeal or upper caste-based appeal can unite wealthy and poor members of a group to rally around a particular candidate or a particular party. And to me, that really stands out in the US in relation to the rise of Donald Trump. And it harkens back a lot to the kinds of politics you saw in the post-Civil War era in the American South. And so both the United States, comparing to its own past and to India, it really exhibits this sort of politics and political behavior of a ranked ethnic system. And so I think we get a lot of analytical leverage by comparing, the caste politics of India to the racial politics of the United States, and how they propel a specific type of right-wing support that often draws from lots and lots of poor people, even though you might imagine right-wing politics could actually be quite bad for their pocketbook, because right-wing politics comes with anti-redistribution and low tax as an, propeller. And so this is where I think the India and the United States really sort of illustrate the dynamics of politics and political behavior in ranked ethnic systems.
I think it's very interesting. There's this recent book, some of you may have read and heard about, called Caste by Isabel Wilkerson, which is a very interesting, and she's a journalist, right? So she writes kind of from a journalistic, but it's like once you see the comparison, and again, being from Brazil, it really, I think, eliminates a lot of things, right? How this type of system is one where it's very different from a class-based system, right? Because it's something that you're born with, and no matter what you do, it still affects like where you fit into that system. And I think that's very powerful as a tool for kind of understanding, U.S. politics as it is, I think, with Indian politics or any number of other cases. Eugene, Lissel, any thoughts on sort of this aspect?
Just very quickly, I think I could say, I really credit the Black Lives Matter movement quite a bit in sort of making sure that these issues are at the fore, because I think for a long time, there's been in the United States sort of belief that, the civil rights movement is over, and we're in a post-racial society, and, we've made all of this progress. And, we kind of think of the United States as, well, pull yourself up by your bootstraps and you just have to work hard and so forth. And so we don't see the structural dimensions of racism that are built into the system, from federal housing laws, to prison system and so forth. So I think if I take any kind of optimism from this, I think that we're at a moment where we kind of have to reckon more with the identity politics of the moment, with the history that has placed people at disproportionate starting points, if you will, if we're all supposed to pull ourselves up by our bootstraps. And then, kind of also recognizing that we can't just see things from sort of a monolithic identity perspective. One of the, I think, really interesting dynamics that we saw in the Trump election, and Pavi, I think you were sort of alluding to this earlier in our discussion before the panel, was the Latino vote for Trump. And how, you know, despite all of his comments about, you know, immigrants as rapists and criminals and so forth, that because of the very anti-socialist rhetoric that Trump was using that was very appealing to individuals from Cuba, from Venezuela and so forth, you saw, you know, massive turnout for Trump. And in fact, a lot of individuals who said, I don't want to be defined just as a Latino or a Latina. I want to have the American dream. And so I'm going to kind of, you know, put aside that form of my identity. It's not my primary identity. And I think that's really important, you know, to recognize in terms of people who study, as scholars do, who study voting behavior and so forth, that people are not always driven by, you know, just their identity or just their economic interest. And it's much more complicated than that. But I really appreciate Pavi's, you know, invocation of the idea of a ranked society, just to super briefly draw on the Turkish example. You know, you have in Turkey the concept of a white Turk and a black Turk. That's actually a socioeconomic distinction. So Recep Tayyip Erdogan is a black Turk. He calls himself that, and he prides himself on having been able to push aside the Kemalist white Turk elite, cosmopolitan, educated elitists, and sort of bring back the people in a very populist way. But you have the Kurdish issue in Turkey, which the government tried to address for so long as an economic issue. But the idea that if you have Diyarbakir or Mardin on your identity card, you're likely not going to get a job in a lot of cities. That based on the color of your skin, a lot of Kurds tend to have slightly darker skin, that there's an immense amount of prejudice against you. So you definitely, you know, have those elements there as well.
Yeah. So if I might just add, I think Pavi is absolutely right, and I don't see the US exceptional here as well in any respect. Now, it might be caste, it might be race. In the regions I study, it's ethnicity, and for those regions and for those systems, we have a great term called ethnic democracy, which I think with some exceptions applies to what we see with the US when we switch, you know, when we replace ethnic with racial. Yes, it's a democracy, but it's a ranked democracy, and for some ethnic groups, it's more democratic than others, and some ethnic groups are subject to special laws and special restrictions that we clearly saw with regards to voting IDs and attempts at voting suppression. I think what might make does the US make the US somewhat different from, you know, a typical ethnic democracy is that the US system, is the way I see it, is more fluid, and that's what Lisa also alluded to with and probably with the Latino vote for Trump. Ethnic democracies are not supposed to have this widespread support from the minority, and in that the US is different. So, and that probably makes me more hopeful about, you know, the fate of US politics than when I look at other cases, including my own country and the region that I study.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great, I'm sorry, I think it's a great point, because one thing that I see from like what the three of you are saying is sort of there's some fluidity of like the identities, and in the US it might be quite a bit more. I think the Latino example is like, Lisa, I think you mentioned like people may be saying like, you know, I don't want to be sort of defined as a Latino. And that resonates quite a bit for me, like with the respective Brazilian example, where you don't really see like the kind of ethnic voting that you would see even like in the US. Very common, like if you go back in time, there would be like the Irish vote and the Polish vote and the what have you. And let's say in Brazil, there's like a large, you know, community of Japanese descent, but there's no sense in which there is the Japanese vote, right? I'm sure if you control for socioeconomic characteristics, they just vote like anyone else of a similar. So, and that's part because there is some kind of fluidity to these things, which I think has to do with different histories of segregation, sort of geographical segregation that I think are kind of stronger in the US. But that also make, I think, the Black experience in the US peculiar relative to sort of other communities as well, which is, I think, another relevant dimension. But Pavi, you wanted to say something? Yep.
No. I just wanted to agree with Eugene, and I think you said what I wanted to say, which is, there is the black-white divide, which I think in India looks like the upper caste and scheduled caste or the Dalit experience. And then you can imagine the middle castes of India to be analogous to Latinos. And they're sort of trying to figure out where they stay within the rank system. And I think that's what makes politics really hopeful and interesting. It's the role of these middle groups and the potential they have to transform parties, to transform institutions, and to act as a glue between, two groups that sit on the end of the ranked social order. And I think Eugene's absolutely right. That fluidity also gives us hope for, how politics could go in the future.
So I think it's been a great discussion where we've learned that the US is absolutely just like other countries and absolutely unique, just like every other country. Right? But I wanted to give each of you some time to kind of, come with some closing remarks, thoughts and prayers for the future. So let me actually run that in reverse alphabetical order and start with Pavi. What are we left with, Pavi?
Well, my research tells me that we're right now left with a huge institutional mess. And so I wish the Biden administration a lot of luck in fixing the bureaucratic mess he's been left with, and hoping we will build back a stronger and more stable federal government that can withstand an attack like it went through in the previous few years. So I'm very hopeful for like a stronger bureaucratic comeback after the experience of the past few years.
And sometimes bureaucracies get a bad reputation, right? But it's we've been seeing a bit of the flip side of that. Lissel.
I guess I'll take the pessimistic side. I tend to, I don't know why. But I would just say that my research looking at groups that have been mobilized don't go away easily. If you look at, we were, again, before the panel kind of talking earlier about Trump as a figure and is he unique, and will other people mobilize, around a different figure? Does he bring a particular concatenation of characteristics to the table that can't be replicated? But when you have a large segment of the population, and think about how many millions voted for Trump for perhaps different reasons, who have been told that they were lied to, and have been told that their future is being taken away from them, and who've been told that, if you're not a white patriotic American, then, you don't belong, and so forth, that have been told that immigrants and Muslims and, all different sorts of groups are others. And you've been kind of riled up by this emotion and this time with a leader in power that is feeding you with these narratives. That sentiment doesn't go away just because they're not in power. And I think it'll be fascinating to see the sort of track that the Republican Party takes. Are they going to use Trump as a success example and continue to kind of stay on this nativist, exclusionary track? Are they going to tack back? I think that's going to be really something fascinating to watch. But I would just say, irrespective of maybe who appears in the future to mobilize that base that is so restless and frustrated now, they're there and they're angry, and I don't think they're going away anytime soon. So I think we just need to really be conscious of that. I'll end on a positive note, I guess. If there's one thing that I'm looking at as a silver lining, it's that we are increasingly talking about the presence of white supremacist groups, and we're not denying that they exist. And we're saying this is their ideology, right? And I think that's extremely important. So the more mainstream that idea becomes, and the more serious we take it as a domestic threat, the better.
Yeah, I think that's fascinating is a word to use about like what the future holds. There are others perhaps a little scary. I think it actually gets to the point about which could lead us into a whole another discussion about how to deal with political agents and individuals and forces that have been implicated in sort of certain actions, and kind of how to process that with the goals of stability and rule of law and justice and so on. But that's all a lot of food for thought. Eugene. What are your thoughts?
Thank you. So I'm also quite pessimistic in the short term, like Liesl, but more optimistic in the long term. So the reason for pessimism is that I agree with Liesl that groups that mobilize remain mobilized. And if someone wants to read a really wonderful book about what happens, it's a 1950 social psychology book by Leon Festinger called When Prophecy Fails, which looks at a small cult of UFO believers in the Chicago area and how they cope with no UFO coming. And it doesn't bode pretty well for the US politics when we're talking about large numbers of those people, again, in the short term. So with that, I am pessimistic. What I am optimistic about, and that also relates to what Liesl said, is that finally the US government starts taking those domestic armed groups seriously. I do expect that we are going to have some more pretty violent and pretty nasty and maybe potentially quite bloody events in the short term, but at least I see some signs that, finally it clicked, and finally it's not just rhetoric about domestic terrorism, but hopefully some action as well. Because yes, those groups remain mobilized, but they also can be repressed if needed. And that goes to Pavi's point about restoring bureaucratic capacity, including bureaucratic capacity to repress.
Yeah, and I think to end on, I think summarizing a little bit of what my reading is of the sort of general takeaway and the sentiment here is, again, like there's a lot of similarities with other cases that may lead us to be concerned with what's coming next, but without losing sight of the things, again, both from the similarities, but also from the distinctiveness of the U.S. experience and history, and they may also, perhaps give us something to work with going into the future. But again, I wanted to thank the panel. I wanted to thank all the audience for being with us here. I think it's been a tremendously illuminating discussion. Again, as happens with the best of these discussions, that leaves us with a lot of answers, but also questions and thoughts, and sort of hungry to learn more about things. And I think that illustrates what SAIS is about, and kind of intellectual vibrancy and excitement that we have here. So with that, let's wrap up this really amazing couple of sessions that we've had today. I think hopefully we can have other events of talking about current events, perhaps with less of no insurrections in the near future. But I think it's a great way to sample some of our strengths as an institution, as an intellectual environment, and just to learn a lot, as I have from you guys here. So thanks a lot. Thanks everyone, and hope to see you soon.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.